Welcome to the Parenting Literacy Show. The purpose of this show is to provide information that parents can use to raise children who are physically healthy, intelligent, happy, spiritual, and have good social skills. My name is Dr. Joseph Lau. I'm a developmental psychologist who's been studying how humans grow for the past 41 years. For the last 15 years, I've been studying parenting with an emphasis on understanding the best that parents can be. During this show, I have the privilege of talking with experts about child development and parenting in particular, who know more about the topic than I do. And so each week we'll try to get information for you that can help you raise your children effectively. Today, we are blessed to have with us Dr. Mandy O'Hara. Dr. O'Hara is a pediatrician who is board certified in not only pediatrics, but also in child abuse pediatrics. And so she's somebody who has dedicated her lifetime pretty much to learning as much as she can. Most people, once they get their medical degree, they don't have any more degrees after that. Dr. O'Hara has more degrees after her medical degree than most people had before. And so she's clearly somebody who's interested in the topic. She's also doing empirical research on this topic. And so she knows more about this than most people, and we really are privileged to have her here today. Thank you, Dr. O'Hara, for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great. So let's begin by talking about child abuse. I'll just mention a few facts before we start. I was at a meeting at the United Nations yesterday where we were talking about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And one of the observations they made was since 1990, when it was ratified by most of the countries on Earth, the incidence of child abuse has gone down around the world. So it's not as bad as it used to be. But having said that, the recent statistics from 2018, which is the most recent in the United States, indicate that nearly 700,000 children are abused in the United States every year. That's obviously way too much. Also, one estimate that was going back a few years now shows that we spend as a country approximately $238 million a day because of child abuse. Now that's $1 million, $238 million a day. That's a lot of money every day. So it's literally billions of dollars a year. And all this money is money that we should not have to spend. It's money that we spend because of something that we might be able to prevent if parents knew a little bit more about what would be the best practice for raising your child. And so I want to speak with Dr. O'Hara today about child abuse and some of the forms it takes, and perhaps get some ideas for how we can do better. So Dr. O'Hara, what's the difference between child abuse and child neglect?
Child abuse is the physical infliction of harm by a person legally responsible for the care of a child under age 18. And the physical harm may be minor or major when we're speaking about child abuse. Child neglect, in contrast, is an omission of care by a person legally responsible for the care of a child under the age of 18 that may include not meeting a child's basic needs, such as food, clothing, shelter, education, medical care, even emotional support and love. And it also includes lack of supervision or inadequate guardianship of a child that puts them in harm's way.
I see. Now, most parents think they have a good idea of how to raise their own children. Is it possible that some parents are abusing and neglecting their children without realizing it?
So the practice of spanking or physical discipline is quite common here in the United States, and it is legal and it is not equivalent to child abuse. Yet sometimes with physical discipline, there can be escalating stress. And in that context, a parent may not be aware that physical discipline or spanking may cross the line and actually be abuse.
I see. And what about neglect? Is it possible parents might neglect their children without realizing they're neglecting their children?
Yeah. So the context of child maltreatment in general often includes three factors, or one or a combination of these factors. One is heightened stress. The other is intergenerational practices that haven't been unlearned. And the third is having limited knowledge or misunderstanding about an infant or child's normal developmental capabilities. So in any of these contexts, a parent could be neglecting a child without actually realizing. And actually an additional context may be parental illness, such as untreated mental illness or substance abuse, whereby in that context, a parent may be neglecting a child or physically abusing a child without having intentionality or awareness that they're doing so.
Interesting. There's some research showing that parents who are suffering from depression are at especially high risk of abusing their children or neglecting their children in particular. The parents have their own issues. They're obsessed about whatever their problem is that's associated with the depression, and so they sometimes will not give the children the attention the children need, not really realizing that they're doing that. Why is this important? How does being abused affect the child?
So, being abused can affect a child both physically and emotionally. Certainly, there may be physical harm, which can be on the surfaces of the skin, or it could really become internal injury uh, involving brain injury, fracture of bones. So, it really can be quite severe physical injury. Emotional ramifications are similarly can involve a spectrum of severity whereby a child who's being abused might model after a parent and experience childhood aggression. There can be learning difficulties, developmental issues, mental health issues such as anxiety or depression. We also may see bully involvement for children who have been abused or neglected. And in adolescence, sometimes increased risk-taking behaviors, and these outcomes may continue well into adulthood if untreated and unrecognized.
Wow. Uh, this then raises another issue in terms of why it's important to society more generally. Some people might argue that what a parent does with his or her child is their business and nobody else's business. But is it also important for society at large?
It is, I think, certainly important for society at large for the purposes of protecting our children. Our children are our futures and depend on society to keep them well and safe, to provide and keep them well and safe. So, first and foremost, parenting practices do, stay in the home, belong in the home within reason. But when it crosses a threshold where there's harm or injury and consequences that can be so devastating and damaging to a child, it is our role as a society and certainly as a medical professional to intervene.
How do you respond to the argument that parents are the caregivers of the children, legally the caregivers of their children, and that nobody else has a right to intervene, that it's family business and not anybody else's business?
Well, I think that argument comes up readily with the notion of spanking or physical discipline, again, which is legal, common, and does not equal abuse. But when we see it cross the line and it's considered excessive, for example, when we start seeing bruises or injury in a child, or we start seeing emotional sequelae with um, uh, you know, uh, mental health or school ramifications that seem to be occurring in a context of escalating stress and physical violence in a home, then it becomes an issue of child safety and child protection. Uh, Many episodes of physical abuse are commonly repeat escalating events. So it may start as one thing, and in the context of stress, in the context of limited supports or knowledge about developmental expectations of a child, um, or again, maybe untreated parental mental illness or substance use, we may see an ongoing escalation putting a child in harm's way. And when that occurs, when we are seeing, the outcomes of injury to a child or emotional damage to a child, it then is in a legal responsibility as well that we intervene and abide by laws that we have in place to protect our children.
Ooh, that sounds reasonable. So let me just push this a little bit further. What gives somebody from outside, like the state, let's say, the right to go into a family and tell parents how to raise their children?
Yeah. So we have a national legislation that states very broad definitions of child abuse and neglect, and furthermore states that each individual state in the United States has to have their own medical legal definitions and systems in place for child protection and child safety measures. So then within our states, we do depend on these definitions that here in New York, we, as medical professionals, are legally responsible if we find concern in a child that surpasses a threshold of suspicion for child abuse or neglect, that we have a mandated reporter role.
Mhm.
And that exists within our education system, within our um, law enforcement system, within our medical systems and our social work systems, that well, we are legally in the role in our professions as mandated reporters. So we are all trained to understand what may be suspicious for child abuse or neglect, what might be definitive for child abuse or neglect, and we do have to act accordingly. So within this legal framework, the city agencies then have their legal responsibility to evaluate fully and investigate the level of concern for child safety or child neglect. And at that point, again, they must actually be involved in the home, and in that context, help understand if there's credible evidence of abuse or neglect or not, and regardless, offer any supports or buffering that might prevent any future such events.
Uh, Good points. In addition, I think that it's a common understanding that the state, literally the state, for example, the state of New York, uh, perceives children as citizens of the state and extends its protections not only to the parents, but to the children as well, even as separate citizens. And so while the state recognizes that the parents are responsible for the children, still the state does take some responsibility to make sure that the parent satisfies at least minimum standards of care for the child. So as you're saying, if the parent's care falls below those minimum standards, then the child's health or safety is at risk. And it's not important only to the family and the child, but to society more generally for a few different reasons, right? And we kind of skirted on this. But for example, a child who's being abused will often find that their grades drop in school. And they may all of a sudden not be cooperative. So they may start to have more fights with teachers or with other children. They may start to need remedial services from the schools. There's evidence showing that when parents beat their children, the child's IQ tends to go down. And it's not a huge drop, it's like a 3-point drop on the average, but still the child's intelligence level goes down as measured by the IQ test. And then you also have the issue of children interacting with other children. So that if a child is abused and they have now emotional problems because of the abuse, their relationships with others become strained. It's harder for them to deal effectively with other people. They become stressed themselves, and they show a decrement in the quality of their interpersonal skills. So they don't deal as well with others. And as you suggested, there's a greater likelihood that children become bullies or need medical services. They may require either medical treatment for their bruises or medical treatment for their emotional scars. And this is going to cost money. So all this costs money. And then there's more, because when they grow up and become parents, they may model their behavior as a parent on what they learned as a child and perpetuate the cycle. There's evidence in Great Britain, for example. David Farrington did some interesting studies where he found that approximately 50% of all the crimes in Great Britain are committed by 5% of the families. And so he's doing ongoing research to find out what's causing that relationship. And there's some concern that perhaps it's because parents are mistreating their children, and the children then are turning to a life of crime that they saw in their parents. And so there's a lot of ways in which the misbehaviors of the child then become a burden for society more generally. And of course, in terms of the child, it's always unintentional, right? But then it happens nonetheless. And society may need to step in one way or another and deal with this person who's been, in some real sense, damaged by the people who are most responsible for the care. What can happen to parents who neglect their children or abuse their children?
So, foremost, if there's escalating stress or escalating events that are raising concern or suspicion for abuse or neglect, foremost, a pediatrician for the child or a doctor who's seeing the child might begin by a social work consultation to further explore psychosocial risk factors and what might be going on that we can first help. What are the barriers? What are the triggers? When there is substantial evidence of abuse or neglect, as mandated reporters in our education system, in our medical system, in our law enforcement systems and social work systems, we will refer the family to uh, the state central register, which is a kind of gatekeeper here in New York State, and each state has a hotline or a call number when there is suspicion of abuse or neglect. And from there, an investigation follows that involves a better understanding again of what has occurred, the harm or risk of harm to a child, the options to support and help a family, and a safety assessment for protection of the child.
Would it be correct to summarize what you just said as the parents who are found to be abusing or neglecting their children will ideally be offered services, maybe counseling services and other services to help them do better? Uh, yeah.
Yes, the vast majority of time when there is some identified risk, even if not definitive abuse or neglect, services are offered. And this may include mental health services for parent, child, family. It can also include, if the needs may be, substance abuse services. It might involve simply parent education classes to understand the developmental milestones and capabilities of a child and how best to parent effectively and safely. So to prevent any further um, complications with parenting strategy. It may involve as well sometimes very fundamental support, such as if there wasn't a safe sleep space for a baby, a crib or playpen is provided. So as much as the supports um, that are identified are provided. There are also, regarding mental health treatment options, there are evidence-based mental health treatments in the context of um, adversities in the home that may include many of the things we've talked about, the risk factors, as well as the possible abuse or neglect. And these can be very targeted, intensive preventive services, they're called, that can be very effective at helping a family with their particular maltreatment profile, if you will, for what the specifics are and causing stress and maltreatment in that family.
So it sounds like, in your experience, the first preference is to try to provide services to the family to try to keep the family intact and to improve the delivery of care to the children. Now, those are not the only options. There are other more extreme options.
Yeah.
So what else could the state do?
You know, first and foremost, in the beginnings of such a referral to Children's Services, there is a safety assessment taking place. And if a child or children are in imminent danger, there may be a removal to place these children in a safe environment immediately. That is one possible outcome, but the vast majority of times in investigations for abuse or neglect, the intention is to keep children unified with their biological families. So the majority don't um, um, get removed and placed in another home or foster care. Yet, if there is a need because of imminent danger and safety concern, our agencies work very hard to find what's called kinship placement with a family member or a close friend, so that still children most often remain within their kinship or familial care as much as possible.
There is substantial evidence suggesting that children who are taken out of their homes, especially if they're put into maybe foster care or some kind of institution, run into a lot of increased risks that bode poorly for them. There are other stressors in the institutions, for example, where they often don't get the care they need for a variety of different reasons. So that's a topic for another show. But it is something that I imagine is in the back of your mind when you're thinking about, how to handle a situation where a child is being abused. One other option is that if it's bad enough, the parent could literally be arrested. There have been many cases where the parents have been severely mistreating the children, and the state decided that it was way beyond what was appropriate or acceptable, to the point where they literally arrested the parents. One of the most extreme cases would be the Nix Mary Brown case, where many years ago there was a stepfather who abused his stepdaughter to the point of killing her. And so obviously he was arrested and he was put in jail, where in turn he was abused by the other prisoners, because child abusers don't do well in prison. Now, when parents are abusing their children, do they ever try to cover it up and maybe hide it from other people?
Hmm. So again, the context often of abuse is extreme stress, and there may be some realization when there's injury on a child that's alarming to an entire family dynamic. In that context, there seem to be times where a parent might um, keep a child home from their communities, such as the doctor's office or a school setting, to if there are marks or bruises that they don't want to be identified. So I understand there may be contexts like that may take place, and I think as Good Samaritans as well as professionals, that we need to be hyper vigilant for um, our children in our communities. If there may be some in lack of visibility, or parents are not open about uh, what injuries a child may receive. Another context sometimes with child maltreatment is it may be a primary parent who's legally responsible for the care of a child is not able to protect that child from another person perpetrating or abusing the child. And still, that primary caregiver has a responsibility to protect their child. So if they allow abuse to happen ongoing with knowledge, that also falls into a form of child maltreatment.
Oh, that's interesting. Um, if somebody suspects that, let's say, their neighbor's child is being abused, one place they could contact is the Child Help National Abuse Hotline. The number for that is 1-800-422-4453, and you'll see it right underneath here. So if you suspect that a child is being abused, then you might want to talk to the parents, though that might be a little risky, because sometimes parents are very defensive and won't admit that they're doing abuse, or they may not even realize they're abusing the child. So you can get more information at a national help hotline like that. Now, is there a comparable New York State number, for like a New York State hotline?
The hotline for New York State, well, for one, if and this is a time certainly during the COVID pandemic where children are not as visible in our communities, that it's of utmost important that as family, friends, and neighbors, we offer as much support as possible for
Yes.
parents dealing with the level of stress they may have with children in the household, challenges with remote schooling, financial strain. and even health, sometimes health concerns coming in the way. So we need to, first and foremost, reach out and support parents in our community. But we also have to be hyper vigilant because children are not as visible, and that raises concern we might be missing cases of abuse. So
Yeah.
one thing, if you do suspect a child might be being abused or neglected, is you can begin by calling 311.
Okay.
So that's a simple beginnings. Another public hotline for reporting suspicion of child abuse and neglect is 1-800-342-3720.
Okay. And that's a New York City or New York State number?
New York State.
Okay. Dr. O'Hara, if parents suspect that they may be abusing their own children, or perhaps if they feel like they're under a lot of stress and they feel like they're reaching their wits' end with respect to how they treat their children, um, what should they do?
Hmm. So seeking support is of foremost importance, especially at this day and time during the COVID pandemic. Nobody is alone. Nobody is immune from the tremendous stress that we're all feeling as a really um, a society and across the nation, across the world. So one step towards seeking support would be talking to your pediatrician and voluntarily asking for help when you know that you feel strained and have limited supports and need more resources is does not put one under the radar of an abuse or neglect investigation, but it may actually prevent that down the road and may foremost offer um, a real turning point in um, otherwise, more negative outcomes. So seeking supports wherever you can, including simply from your pediatrician, is one beginnings.
Point. And then one often can reach out to family members as well, either the mother's side or the father's side. They often have family members, adults, often your own parents, the parents of your spouse or the child's parent, often are very helpful. Reaching out to friends, a lot of schools are places where you can meet other people, other adults. There are many organizations people can join to learn more about parenting or to learn more about various issues that come up, whether it has to do with stress or things like that. So by all means, if you feel like you're under a lot of stress, and who doesn't these days, then don't just hold it in. But reach out to others and sort of share your concerns. And often you'll find that other people have found constructive ways of dealing with those stressors that you might be able to use yourself. Uh, we can talk about this for a lot more time. There's so much more to talk about, and yet we're out of time. And so I'm going to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge. I'm really grateful for this. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Now, I hope you find this show interesting and that you found something here that's useful that can help you be a better parent. Thank you for watching today, and I look forward to speaking with you another time. And goodbye.